a tough piece to wrap your mind around. All of the texts, in fact, that we heard this morning speak about, as last week's text did, the importance of wholeness and right relationship. And this text also from the gospel addresses the church, which is, of course, an anachronism. There was no church in Jesus' day, but it is a looking back from Matthew's community's point of view on what Jesus would have taught. The clear message of this text, and I think of the others as well, is that Christians don't have the luxury of writing people off. We don't have the luxury of hating people. We don't have the luxury of saying that somebody who has a recurrent pattern of terrible behavior is beyond the pale. We don't get that. We don't get that from Jesus. We may choose to take it. We may do it, but Jesus doesn't give us that choice. And that's hard to live with. It really is hard to live with. It's hard to understand what Jesus is after here. I'm thinking about Joseph in the story. It's a really fun saga to read. Joseph, sometimes we make kind of a hero of Joseph, but he wasn't pure as the driven snow. He was a problematic character himself. And the story actually includes a great deal of meanness and manipulation on Joseph's part towards his brothers, but let us be fair, they dumped him down a well and left him to die. So, he had some reason to be angry with them. The virtue of Joseph in this particular passage is not that he was utterly magnanimous. He took his time getting to forgiveness. The virtue of Joseph in this text is that he was able, finally, to step back far enough to ask what God's intention for all was, and what would be the best outcome from all of this crazy, horrible, dysfunctional, vicious family dynamic. What would redeem all of it? And Joseph gets it. That to welcome his brothers back into fellowship, now that he is in a position of power. I'm assuming you know the story, perhaps I should tell it. The brothers are jealous of their youngest brother Joseph. They throw him down a well. Through a series of horrible events and miracles, he winds up becoming the most powerful guy in Egypt during the time of a famine. And his brothers come from their homeland to Egypt, asking for help from this man who is now the right hand to Pharaoh himself and has the power to give them grain. And he, in his power, could do anything he wanted to them. He had the choice. And his choice was to welcome them and their families and his father, his aging and ailing father, into the land and offer them a new opportunity to begin again. That's what he chooses. And he says, you meant it for harm, but God has used it for good. God has used it for good. And I'm going with that. I'm going with that. And you got to say good for him in the end, because you weren't sure he was going to get there. But he does. He finally gets there. is not just about coming to a place of psychological comfort. It's not just about me getting along with somebody who's hurt me. But it is about looking to the larger picture. What is best for everybody? What is restorative for everybody? In the long run, I think most of us have experienced to some degree that when we are able to let go of hurt and bitterness and transcend it, and transcend those feelings of pain when we have been violated and hurt, but when we're able to let go of that, we actually feel better. I mean, it's actually good for us. Now, anybody who's really been hurt also knows that that doesn't happen fast. If you've experienced a genuine trauma, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. But when it comes, when that lightening of the load comes, as a result both of grace and choice and circumstance and all the things that get built into it through God's goodness, when that comes, it is a good thing. It's a good thing for us. But Jesus isn't just talking about our psychological state. He's talking about the well-being of the whole. The well-being of the whole community. This is a story he's telling. And remember, it starts with Peter saying, in the church, if this happens. So he's talking about a collective situation. And the story he tells actually is about unequal levels of justice. It's about top-down forgiveness. It's someone who owes another person a debt. So the one with power over is in the position of making the forgiveness happen, as opposed to one who's in a position of vulnerability. And I think that's also really important to hear, because these sorts of texts are usually used to further traumatize victims of domestic violence and violent crime. And I think that's wrong. I don't think Jesus is saying, go ahead and submit yourself to further abuse and violence. I do not believe that's Jesus' intention at all. But nevertheless, the larger picture of what will create wholeness for all, the idea of restorative justice as opposed to vengeance. I love the line in Fiddler on the Roof when Tevye says, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth leaves the whole world blind and toothless. It may feel good. Revenge may feel good in the moment that one exacts it, but it doesn't feel good in the long run. It just creates more chaos and harm. And as a society where we have power over one another, we must wield that power with the utmost care, compassion, and concern for the health of the whole community. I thought it was interesting that our paper this morning featured a conversation between the candidates for prosecutor. And one of the things they were talking about was just this issue of retributive justice versus restorative. That what is good for the society is not to just punish somebody, but to have that person be held accountable for their actions, and then given the resources they need to not perpetrate those actions again in the future. The education, the support, the community backing. We are so much better off, just in terms of the bottom line alone, just as taxpayers, we are better off with programs like Drug Court, which really help people get over their issues and get on with life. We're much better off than locking more people up in jail. Financially, just financially. Spiritually, I think you can write that across the sky. That God's hope, and intention for communities is for wholeness for the victims, for wholeness for the community, and wholeness for the perpetrators, for folks who have gone off that end and made those choices. And it works. Not in a tidy way, not in an easy way, but forgiveness, when it is a value that we hold at our core, as understanding that we ourselves are gifted by God with forgiveness, and therefore empowered from that place of love to be transformed, to be made more whole, to be made more capable of living out God's ideals and intentions for us. If we understand that from within ourselves and then can extend that same kind of understanding to others, it is salvific. It is changing for us, it is changing for our church, it is changing for our community. The example that I think is one of the most profound is of Desmond Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, and the story of how, in a situation where horrific acts of violence and oppression were committed, a whole country, made a project of naming the harm that was done, holding accountable the folks who caused the harm, putting them in a position of hearing and understanding the harm they caused, and yet at the same time, not descending into retributive violence. It wasn't a tidy thing. You read any of the transcripts of it at all, and not entirely satisfactory. It wasn't satisfactory. Not everybody got the sense that their perpetrator understood their behavior and were changed. It didn't happen that way. But sometimes it did. And sometimes just the very act of naming what happened in a collective place allowed the healing to happen that needed to happen, so that the society could begin to move on, not sweeping what happened before under the carpet, nor descending into the chaos of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but actually moving on to the next possible place. I think as people of faith, we are invited to personally engage the work of forgiveness at the deepest levels and at the community level. Jesus' statement that you must forgive your brother or sister from your heart if you want to experience God's forgiveness. I don't understand that cosmically, but I do understand it experientially. I do understand that when I choose to be in a place of hatred and judgment toward somebody else, that it disturbs my capacity to experience God's loving presence for me. That's just how it works. That when I am wrapped up in hating somebody, or resenting somebody, or considering myself superior to somebody, even if I have every objective reason to do so, it alienates me from God. And my own capacity to understand myself as beloved and forgiven. That's tough work. And that's part of why forgiveness is good for us. Forgiveness is good for us when we can get there. by God's grace. I'm hearing in this teaching of Jesus an invitation to escape hell, our own hell, to be ultimately freed from being continually harmed mentally and psychologically by the past and by trauma from the past. And I want to say that without laying another burden upon those of you who know trauma. I do not say that by way of saying you should be better. Hurry up and get over this. I say it by way of offering some hope. To understand that God's grace over time softens these wounds, and that we can move towards healing and resolution. And that God's ultimate will in the situation is wholeness for all, and peace for all, and reconciliation for